In the coming week, tense OPEC meetings get underway in Vienna. Turkey holds national elections, and the Trump administration grapples with its zero-tolerance illegal immigration policy. It's June 21st, 2018, and time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Jim Lindsay. Bob, let's start with what I know to be one of your favorite places, Vienna, Austria.
Yes, indeed.
Not Vienna, Virginia, but Vienna, Austria. OPEC members are going to be gathering in the Austrian capital to decide output policy. This meeting comes amid calls from major fuel consumers like the United States and China to decrease oil prices and to get OPEC to support the global economy by producing more crude. Now, OPEC has been unable to reach a deal, due in large part to disagreements between Iran and other member nations over the proposed output increase. I take it that OPEC members' interests aren't all aligned on this issue. So explain why it is that Iran is the country leading the charge not to increase output.
Well, I should mention, Jim, that as we enter this podcast, as sometimes happens, there are fluid developments going on, and the latest reports indicate that Iran may, in fact, be on board with an output increase of up to 1 million barrels a day. Now, it has reservations, as do several other nations that don't have what it's called spare capacity or that much spare capacity.
Swing producers.
Swing producers, unlike the biggies like the Saudis and non-OPEC states like Russia, which is trying to make common cause like it did 2 years ago with OPEC states. Iran is among states like Venezuela and Iraq that does not have much spare capacity, and thus an increase. An agreement on increase in output has the effect, or has the feared effect, of them continuing to produce what they're producing without and getting less money for it. So the cuts that OPEC agreed to definitely have had an impact on prices. Too much, according to a number of people, including the President of the United States. And that's another reason why I think the Iranians have been kind of irked by this proposal, because they see it as kind of caving to, U.S. President Trump, who not too long ago pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, calling the shots for OPEC.
Right. And in doing that, what President Trump said is that he's going to have the U.S. government target any countries that do business with Iran. Obviously, Iran's big export being oil.
Correct.
One of its major customers being India, another being China. The Indians have said they're not going to abide by the U.S. sanctions. We'll see if that, in effect, holds up. I mean, this is happening at a time when a lot of Venezuelan production, as I understand it, is going offline because Venezuela is a mess. And
they simply cannot maintain it anymore. And again, Venezuela is one of the world's huge, if not largest, oil reserves, and at one time a proud, large oil infrastructure has been crumbling, and people are going off job because they can't even eat. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but there's a governance collapse there that is affecting its ability to produce oil, and it's among the things that was seen as leading to the increase in oil prices that was marked late this spring.
Yeah, well, we're seeing gasoline prices here in the United States go up now. I think they normally go up in the summer. People do a lot more driving,
right.
But I think this isn't simply people spending more time in their Camrys and Subarus, but because sort of the wholesale price of oil has gone up.
That's right. It's fluctuated, though. I think if you close watchers of the pumps, as American, car-going Americans are, saw it going up to that sort of average of over $3 a gallon, and now it seemed to have declined a little bit. So given what's going on geopolitically and geoeconomically, there is major concern that these prices were going to go up on a steady ascent.
Where does U.S. oil production fit into this? We talked about the United States and China being major consumers of foreign oil, but the United States is also a major oil producer, and I believe there's talk that by the end of this year, the United States will become the world's largest producer of petroleum. A lot of that is because of the so-called process of fracturing, going in and being able to get oil from places where it was previously impossible or difficult to do at a price you can make a profit on. Now we're going to be seeing a lot more activity in that area because at a certain point it becomes profitable again to really invest in fracking. That's my sense in the so-called West Permian Basin, which is West Texas, and I think it's the Permian Basin in West Texas and eastern New Mexico.
Right. You hear that mentioned a lot. You hear the Bakken Reserve in North Dakota. So, yeah, the U.S. is very much involved, is always been an interested observer in these OPEC meetings, but in particular these days because it is such a big player. Interestingly, there's several major U.S. executives who are going to attend in their private capacity have pulled out of this upcoming meeting. I'm not clear exactly why, but yeah, I think the U.S. and certainly the Trump administration has been moving to ratchet up the U.S. capability to produce more oil. And there's a cross section of interest here, right? There are interests by the Trump administration in seeing prices lower at the pump for the U.S. There's also interest, though, in seeing conditions favorable towards developing and exploiting oil reserves. And
that's something. This seems to be sort of cross purposes here, because if administration policy persuades major oil exporters to produce more, drives prices down, it makes it less profitable for American oil producers to do it at the same time that their costs are going up, because a lot of people doing the fracking need to lay pipe made out of steel. We've just slapped.
Well, you've gotten into a whole other series of issues that are a backdrop to these meetings, Jim, which is a trade war on the horizon and the impact that has on things like the creation of or the use of materials that are under tariff, as well as what tariffs do ultimately to demand. And there has been this surging demand in oil. It has been a robust energy market, even as alternatives have been booming, and even as countries like China are pouring more and more money into R&D for alternatives and non-petrol alternatives. Oil remains, viable and will be for at least the immediate foreseeable future, if you want. You can define that as you will. And so the U.S., as with a number of things with the Trump administration, there are sort of immediate responses, and there are sometimes fuzzy strategic considerations that don't always enter the picture right off the bat. I think we're still seeing that. We're still trying to sort out, the long view on trade, for example. And so I'm actually going to be kind of waiting to see and interested to see what is the U.S. response to it if it does go forward with a $1 million barrel a day increase on output. What is the U.S. position, and how does the U.S. oil industry respond to that? Because there are knock-on effects.
Yeah, well, I think you're quite right. And I know there are a lot of smart people. We call them experts, who are spending a fair amount of time taking pencil to paper, or actually using incredibly complex computer algorithms to try to figure out how the intersection of these various trends are all going to net out. And I think, one of the great sort of threats to the global economy, which has been weakening in recent months, even as the economy of the United States is sort of running full tilt, is a sharp spike in oil prices. And always the question, you have one domino falls, does it knock down any others? You have a long set of chain reactions. And again, throwing in sort of normal economics, and then the whole issue of tariffs and how far is President Trump willing to go, and at the same time, how far are the Chinese willing to go? And this becomes very, very, very hard to forecast.
Jim, let's move a little bit southeast from Vienna to the country of Turkey. Turkey was supposed to have an election day in November. It's moved it up to this weekend. Voters are going to head to the polls.
I think it was November 2019.
I'm sorry, November 2019. President Erdogan has moved up the vote in hopes that he can maybe take a bit of preemptive action and stave off concern over the downturn in Turkey's currency and economy and garner support. Erdogan has been moving inexorably towards tightening control over the levers of power in his country. And some might wonder, why is he so intent on these elections happening now? So, Jim, maybe a little bit of background. What's at stake with these elections?
Well, Erdogan is trying to consolidate his power. Trends have been working against him economically and politically in Turkey. And as best I can tell, he decided it was better to call a snap election rather than to wait for the regularly planned election in November of 2019. Now, we've seen other world leaders call snap elections in countries where such things are possible. Theresa May did it in Britain. Didn't work out terribly well for her. And the big question is this going to work out well for Erdogan? Certainly a lot of the experts weighing in on these issues are saying if Erdogan could have a do-over, he might want to have a do-over on his decision because I think right now, looking at polls, many people believe that Erdogan will not get the magic 50% plus that he needs to avoid a runoff. and that if you get into a runoff, that could sort of demonstrate his weakness, that he isn't the commanding figure that everybody had thought. The other interesting thing going on here is for the first time in Turkish history, they're going to have a presidential election timed at the same time as their parliamentary elections. Historically in Turkey, those two were separated out. And again, traditionally in Turkey, the office of president was more ceremonial or symbolic. The real power broker, real leader was the prime minister. Erdogan changed that.
He did sort of a Putin on that.
Yeah, he decided that he wanted to stay in power, and he switched over to being president. And the prime minister now takes a back seat to him. If you look at Turkey's economy right now, it's not doing terribly well. Inflation's at 12.5%. Unemployment is above 10%. And significantly, the exchange rate between the Turkish lira and the U.S. dollar has moved against Turks. If you were to go back 5 years ago, if you had 2 Turkish lira, you could buy $1. Well, today, if you want to buy a dollar using Turkish lira, you need 4 of them. Okay, now obviously, to the extent that the dollar is used in international exchange, tourism, buying goods, and what have you, that means things have got a lot more expensive, and that's why inflation is over 12%. You also have political issues. You mentioned that Erdogan has taken Turkey in a more authoritarian direction, and quite clearly a lot of Turks don't like that and are concerned about the changes he wants to make to the constitution, what it means for the future of Turkey. You also have the issue of the Kurds. You have the issue of Turkey's policy in Syria and its opposition to the Kurds there. One of the big questions on Sunday's vote is whether or not the HDP, it is the pro-Kurdish party, is going to break the 10% barrier. And if it does, that will allow it to take seats in the parliament. And indeed, there is a chance that at the end of the day, Erdogan's party will lose its majority in the Turkish parliament. And if that happens, it's going to make it a lot harder for Erdogan to be able to put his imprint on policy and power.
Do we know to what extent there are options for people going to the polls in Turkey? I mean, are they going to have people and other presidential candidates to choose from that are seen as viable?
Well, there are 2 other major presidential candidates. One is Muharrem İnce. He's the head of the Republican People's Party, which goes by the acronym CHP. It's a center-left party. He's a former school teacher. He's been hammering Erdogan over his proposed constitutional reforms, as well as excessive spending. But he's polling only at about 25%. Erdogan in recent polls is in the high 40s. Another contender is Meral Akşener, and she is the founder of the New Center-Right Good Party, and she's going after Erdogan's right-wing nationalists, sort of coming at him from the other side. And she was an interior minister in Turkey in the 1990s, and again is hammering Erdogan for mismanaging the economy and for his dictatorial ways. But she's only at about 12%. So you're looking at, this is of course, the challenge you have is that you may have many Turks not liking Erdogan and what he's doing to the country, but they can't agree on what the replacement policy or replacement person is. They can't coalesce around a particular person or a set of policies. So I think everyone would expect that Erdogan will eventually retain his title as president. That's not the issue. It's will he demonstrate, or will these elections demonstrate he's much weaker politically than people imagined, and will he lose the ability to have his party control the parliament?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and to what extent is this reflected in his foreign policy? Does he come out, does it sort of rein in Turkey's role in places like Syria? Does he come out more combative, or vis-a-vis the United States? That's a tense relationship as well.
Oh, I mean, in terms of foreign policy, Erdogan has a whole lot of problems. Again, he lives in a dangerous neighborhood. I mean, the Turks live in a dangerous neighborhood bordering Syria. That's been a long-standing problem. We've talked many times about the fact that Erdogan wants Assad to go, but he doesn't want Syrian Kurds to become a major player or factor, and that separates or puts Erdogan's policy at odds with U.S. foreign policy, because the United States has been big backers of the Syrian Kurds. In terms of how this will all play out, I know there's been a lot of speculation that if the election doesn't turn out the way Erdogan wants it to, that he's going to move to call new elections. We saw him do that once before when a Kurdish party had done well at the polls. So Erdogan's approach generally has been, when he's struck, to strike back rather than to turn the other cheek and play meek. But, I think it's a little bit premature to guess how he's going to react to the results of the election, because no one really knows what the results of the election are. And a lot of it's going to depend upon who turns out and how free and fair the elections are. And there's great concerns, particularly in the Kurdish portion of Turkey, or the part of Turkey that has a very large Kurdish population.
And we're talking about 15 million, 20 million people.
Yeah, they're about 20% of the population overall, whether or not people are going to be able to go vote, whether they'll be disrupted, and the like. So I think there's a lot hanging on this to see how it plays out. But clearly, Erdogan is in a far shakier political position than he was 2 or 3 years ago. And it's, again, a mix of economy not doing well, people worried about where he's going, divisions within the society, a foreign policy that is alarming people, and they're all sort of coming together. But I would imagine, best I can tell, the biggest driver is, if you're going to be a powerful leader who's promising to deliver the goods, you got to deliver the goods. And I think for a lot of Turks, so we'll think of it as the movable middle, people who may have been with him before, moving away from him. I think the economy has a lot to do with things here. Bob, let's come back stateside and talk about the biggest story of the week. It's dominated the news, and I'm talking about the Trump administration's new zero-tolerance immigration policies along the U.S.-Mexico border. These policies are being condemned by Democrats and Republicans alike, and at the center of their outrage is the reality that more than 2,300 children have been taken from their parents, who've been detained for criminal prosecution for entering the country illegally. The children have been separated and are being held in detention facilities, not the most ideal of conditions. The one I saw, I think, was a converted Walmart.
In Brownsville.
Brownsville. Now, yesterday, President Trump signed an executive order reversing the administration's policy of separating immigrant parents from children. As late as last Friday, he said he didn't have the legal authority to do that, but he has changed his mind. So why did the president, who's known for not giving in, give in?
There's a huge amount of speculation on that, Jim. As we come into this podcast, this is a fluid story, and it could have many more permutations within the time we even, tape this cast. But in general, it's seen as a sort of a tactical move. He went out last night, so the policy change was announced, or the executive order was announced Wednesday. Wednesday night, he goes to his quote-unquote base in Duluth, Minnesota, and gives a fiery speech about strength and not giving in on zero tolerance and defending the United States and
so
promoting the strength of the country.
What is zero tolerance? I mean, there's the child separation policy, and then there's zero tolerance. Are they the same thing or different?
One is the separation policy is seen as wrapped up in zero tolerance in terms of among the many aspects of it is no more status quo response to this tide of people coming across the border. And by the way, there, by all accounts, seems to be a steady flow of people across the border. Texas border is what we're talking about in particular. And it also seems to be, although it's the border with Mexico, these are not Mexicans primarily. They are Central Americans. We've talked before about how a number of Central Americans from states which are really involved in a bit of state failure, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, they are coming across, and it's parents being separated from children. But it's also a policy that involves raids on factories where illegal immigrants are suspected of working. We just had this happen last night as well in Ohio. Almost a couple hundred people were apprehended, and people without documentation, and many of them were Central Americans as well, working at a plant in Ohio. It speaks to this exasperation, really, by the Trump administration and its core supporters that the country has allowed a situation to get out of control where there are millions of people in the country illegally working, and some of them, in their words, posing a threat and being allowed to pose a threat.
Well, the word the president used was infest.
Right. And so
I
there's
think
language.
a pretty loathsome.
There's very ugly
implication.
language he's applying towards this. There are certainly many accounts, and there's empirical evidence that a rise in immigration of any sort is not accompanied by a rise in crime. As a matter of fact, in some cases, it's the opposite trend direction. However, there are certainly anecdotal cases where illegal immigrants, have been responsible for crimes and horrible crimes.
Yeah, the statistics are pretty clear that on average, immigrants or illegal immigrants or undocumented workers
Right.
are less likely to commit crimes. But when you do have people committing crimes, they get a lot more attention.
As well as the sense of communities, especially in the so-called red states that have supported President Trump, feeling like their communities they're losing control of their communities, that they don't know what it's like to be American anymore, and so forth, whether it's a question of language or it's a question of, what these communities now represent. They feel like it feels like a foreign invasion to them. So again, this has been a theme since the campaign of then candidate Trump kicked off. His number one theme is immigration, and zero tolerance is also wrapped up in the refrain to build a wall. We heard again the chanting of "build this wall" last night. There is, we should note, there's also some legislation being considered this evening, and this will also be playing out into the weekend. Some bills that might deal with a whole number of immigration reform issues, including the so-called dreamers and people who came in as children and could be deported. Many of them to Mexico.
I want to go back to the question of people coming into the United States illegally, people at the border. You mentioned that many of the people being detained are from Central American countries, notably El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And I think at this point it's probably useful to sort of break some of these up into categories, because I think there's a tendency in this debate to sort of mix things together. I mean, there are issues of people coming to the United States as what we call economic migrants, seeking a better life, hoping to go somewhere and get a job and make money, send it back home. But as I understand it, many of the people coming across the border right now from Central America are coming to the United States in hope that they can apply as asylum seekers. And there's a whole set of laws governing people seeking asylum. It's not a crime by itself to seek asylum. And again, people coming from Central America are saying they want to come because they are fleeing violence, threat of death in their homeland. And that's not an unreasonable claim to make on the face of it in general. I will note that when you look at the countries that have the highest homicide rates, that is the highest number of homicides per 100,000 people, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala are all in the top 10. El Salvador is actually, by a country mile, the country with the highest per capita homicide rate at 108 homicides per 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's 22 times higher than it is in the United States, where the homicide rate is about 4.9 per 100,000 people. So we have people coming in who are seeking asylum. So why are they ending up being prosecuted? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, it's part of what makes this such a complex, wrenching, emotional issue. And there's a lot of law, and there's a lot of law on the books regarding how these people are supposed to be treated, how minors are supposed to be treated, and administration is trying to navigate this amid its zero tolerance policy. Add to that places like El Salvador are notorious for gang violence, and you've heard the MS-13 gang invoked a lot. We hear it in I live in Virginia. You hear it in Virginia state politics. Now in statewide elections that that Republican candidates have been recently accusing Democrats of being sort of for MS-13. Yep. It's become actually a campaign issue on the governor level, but also on other levels too.
Well, there have been some very well-publicized murders by MS-13 gang members.
And let's make no mistake, this is a nasty gang, incredibly violent, and they have. But
it was born in the United States.
It was born in the United States. And
we deported a lot of them back to
right. This is an
Central
issue that has bedeviled U.S. presidents, governors, you name it, for decades now. And it gets back to, what is ultimately going to solve this problem is going to be, the U.S. helping to work with the home country to try to deal with the root causes of these problems. Try to help them by way of whatever is it policing help? Is it some sort of aid? Whatever it takes. We're hearing this a little bit, and we'll get to this, I think, later in the podcast. We're hearing this about the debate going on in Europe as well in terms of trying to stanch the flow. And there has been some talk in this direction, Jim, but it's this blanket attempt to try to just sort of cut off the flow at the border, and also to sort of tar with a brush, the same brush, some people who could be criminals or criminally minded with people legitimately seeking asylum under international law, and then families just desperate to sort of try to seek something new. Certainly they've heard about the crackdown by the U.S. officials, and maybe that has even expedited the rush to try to get in before the policy is really settled. The other thing is that the infrastructure for the U.S. as of now, and you mentioned 2,300 children seized, is under strain. It's at capacity. So the U.S. has to come up with, and its leaders, its members of Congress have to come up with some sort of policy that is going to set in place, and not only a plan for immediate future, but for many months, if not years down the road, to try to field the volume. And as a nation of laws, as all sides in this argument, have tried to stress, how do you deal with, prosecuting these cases? These people are all being charged with crimes. And then, under the laws that have been set, how you detain minors, where you detain them. Is the U.S. military involved? We're hearing more and more about that. That's sort of precedent setting. That there are many, many issues, Jim, that make this just a real mess for anybody, but especially this administration that has announced and has staked its reputation on a hard line.
Just three quick reactions. Number one, you mentioned that there's talk about addressing root causes. I think that talk is pretty muted. And I think this is an administration that has shown no interest in dealing with root causes. It wants to deal with symptoms, and it's going to display strength. I mean, that's a word that shows up in a lot of the president's talk, and I think their calculation was they were going to impose this zero tolerance policy, make it as painful as possible for people to enter the country, that would then deter people. I mean, this is what administration officials said. And I think what they didn't count on or factor into their calculation is that people would get to see not just people thinking about coming to the United States, but people who live in the United States would see this policy and decide that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And I think public opinion polls show something order of 2 out of 3 Americans dislike this policy. So I think that's point number one. Number two, you mentioned people fleeing these countries for gang violence. One of the interesting things that I don't think has been heavily reported on is that Attorney General Jeff Sessions, as I understand it, has changed the criteria that the U.S. government is going to use to process asylum seekers' claims by saying that fleeing drug violence or gang violence is not a qualifying factor for asylum. I imagine that will be litigated. We'll see that it plays out. But that plays into this because it would deny the argument that people are making, I should get asylum because they just killed my family back in El Salvador or in Honduras. I think the third thing is you mentioned Congress needs to do something, and it would be great if it could, but we have seen that Congress is right now dysfunctional, in large part because the majority party is at odds with itself on this issue.
Very much so.
No agreement. Yeah. And that has derailed things. But it's not just Congress that needs to do something. I think the administration needs to do something. And this is what is, I think, for many Americans watching the news, most painful is it seems like the administration itself is unsure of what it is doing and why. It seems to be contradicting itself left and right. And there have been a spate of stories which we'll find out how true they are as more investigations are being done, but certainly raise questions about whether or not the United States government actually knows what it's doing with the people it is separating. And again, one of the very unpleasant reality of this separation policy is that parents can be deported very quickly. However, for a variety of legal reasons, children can't. So you really run into the potential where parents could be deported, and it may be months or even years before they're united with their children and children with their parents. And I think any American, whether you have children or don't have children can look at those images and be horrified by what you're seeing, because you can identify with those kids and there's something that doesn't feel quite right.
No, those are all good points, Jim. And you mentioned some constituencies. I would just add to that, as important, let's say, role players in the weeks and months ahead is the media. Again, we heard, for example, the wrenching audio of what sounded like and seems to have been verified of children sort of crying after being separated from their parents, young children, and many other depictions of these facilities, but also trying to hold the administration to account for the decisions. And there was one piece in the Washington Post that counted 14 sort of variations on responses to this. So media is going to be important. I think you're going to have cities, you're going to have mayors, governors, 8 governors by latest count had refused to send National Guard troops to take part in this.
Well, that's significant. I think you saw in the governor of Massachusetts this week say that he would not send the Massachusetts National Guard down to aid the U.S. government in this.
You've got private sector actors. You had some major U.S. airlines announcing we're not going to take part in transporting individuals, our children under this policy. And so there's lots of it's again one of these test cases for the where the U.S. sort of draws its power and its influence from, and it's all playing out in this case. One other thing I would mention that's going to be interesting to watch as we get into the summer is we've got upcoming Mexican elections on July 1st.
López Obrador.
And López Obrador
the acronym AMLO.
Right. AMLO is by all accounts the sort of confirmed front runner and soon to be next leader of Mexico. Mexico as a transit state for many of these migrants and illegal border crossers, we'll say, at this point, could play a major role or not in potentially stopping this flow or having some sort of impact on it. That remains to be seen. There is very tough relations right now between the U.S. and Mexico for a variety of reasons we talked about before. But I do think I just mentioned that as something to keep an eye on.
Well, but again, the Mexicans would say there's a root cause here, which is that in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala in particular, you have failing states, untold levels of violence, and Mexicans would say, with some justification, this problem is fueled by the demand in the United States for illegal drugs and the fact that the United States has very lax gun laws and lots of guns go south. Drugs go north, guns go south. It's a problem for Mexico. It's a problem throughout Central America. And again, various presidents of different parties have grappled with it. Some have tried to grapple with the root causes and found it very difficult because the root causes are quite complicated. Issues of nationalism come in. And so I don't want to in any way suggest someone if you focus on root causes, the problem goes away.
Right. So it's a potentially defining moment in terms of, does it bring the country to a point where it's making decisions that can sort of strike that crucial balance of sort of humanitarianism and border security and tough border security measures that are adequate enough, certainly to strike that the right tones with various political bases. I don't think we're anything close to that yet.
No, we're not, and we're going to struggle with it, and it's obviously a very live issue in American politics.
Well, this leads smoothly to our next section of the podcast, Jim, which is Audience Figures of the Week. Yeah, you can submit your audience figures by emailing twnw@cfr.org or tweeting @CFR_org using hashtag TWNW. We did another poll of our Twitter followers this week, and the winning figure of the week is a person, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor. Jim, why is this figure important?
Chancellor Merkel has had a very rough, very tough, very bad week.
No good, rotten.
And she's facing an internal rebellion within her party at home and facing growing criticism and resistance from other countries in Europe, most notably Italy. In the week, sort of the two big issues for the Chancellor is that, number one, she's come under fierce criticism within her own party. Led by the Interior Minister, who's the head of a coalition within the German government. If you understand the Christian, the political party that Chancellor Merkel heads up consists of the Christian Democratic Union in alliance with the Christian Social Union of Bavaria. And that has been an alliance that's been pretty strong for the last, I think, 7 decades.
Set up by the legendary Strauss, Franz Josef Strauss. Yeah.
And it's been sort of the dominant player in German politics, and we're seeing fissures, and it's coming up exactly over this issue of migration. You may recall Chancellor Merkel pursued a policy that brought more than 1 million refugees into Germany, And essentially, her interior minister said enough is enough. And I think she has beaten back that internal party challenge for now. But the question is how that's going to go. Meantime, you have a new government in Italy. It's a coalition government. We talked about it before. One member of the coalition is the League, which was historically the far-right anti-immigrant party known as the Northern League. It's now part of the government. The interior minister is Matteo Salvini, who's the head of the League. And this week, Italy announced that it was not going to accept or allow ships that rescued migrants trying to make it to Europe from coming into European ports. They should be coming into Italian ports. And that has led to basically a shouting match, most notably between President Macron of France and Italy. And I know this weekend there's going to be an emergency meeting on migration involving 10 EU leaders. So this is an issue that is really roiling European politics. We talked about it a lot on this podcast, but I think clearly for Chancellor Merkel, her sort of inbox of difficult, thorny problems is growing, and it's sort of a mix of political, geopolitical, and I should mention economic problems, because this week she reached an agreement with President Macron about how to approach a variety of issues in the Eurozone. And just as we were sitting down on this podcast, I saw something come across the news wire saying that the Premier of Bavaria, again, part of the CSU, which is part of her political coalition, said that he has no intention of having Germany pursue a path where Germany spends more money on other members of the Eurozone. Again, for a lot of Germans, they look out at the world and their worldview is we are upright, conservative people who are very careful with how we spend our money. And there are all these other people, particularly in the southern rim of the European Union, Eurozone, who don't have the same kind of fiscal discipline. And so I think this is just a big set of challenges for the Chancellor.
They don't have the same fiscal discipline, but they also are on the front lines without the proper resources to deal with numbers of migrants that nobody ever envisioned as well. So Greece, Italy in particular, are dealing with a massive problem. These issues are spilling together, Jim, and we're looking at a doozy of an EU summit coming up.
Oh, it's a doozy. And again, we, I think a while ago, had this notion that somehow humanity, or certainly Europe, had transcended nationalism. And we could talk about the global citizen and how cosmopolitan Europe was. And the EU sort of brought down national barriers. Well, we're seeing a resurgence of nationalism. And again, nationalism can be a very powerful force. If you're watching the World Cup, it's, there's some amusement to, big rivalries, if Germany's to play England and things like that. But it also can have a real ugly side to it as people revert to all kinds of stereotypes about each other, and we've seen them activated. There's a historical memory that governs this. And so these things can get difficult because it sort of nationalist sentiment can complicate the ability to cut deals and find compromises. And again, because in each country, you can have people who are going to use any reasonable settlement as an opportunity to make political hay by arguing that the other has been treating you unfairly and they're being allowed to get away with it. And we've seen historically. And it's not just in Germany, and it's not just in the United States, in plenty of places that can become politically powerful. And the remarkable thing, I think, of the 70 years after World War II was the extent to which the political consensus opposed it. It was almost as if, having lived through World War II, that we had been, in some sense, inoculated against it because everybody had memory of how terrible that was. And in some sense, that historical memory is wearing off.
The end of history, Jim, not ending?
The end of history does not appear to have, in fact, ended. I think, wasn't it William Faulkner who said...
past is not yet past?
Yeah, past is... I think there's a lot of truth to that history continues, and I think we as people are often surprised that our certainties are shown to not be very certain at all. But what about you, Bob? What is your figure of the week?
Well, Jim, I'm getting out of the past, and I'm going for the future, my figure of the week. And it is 6, as in the potential new number of military branches in the United States if President Trump's Space Force actually comes into being. We heard in the midst of talk about the immigration problem, the president gave a big speech involving invoking the need for the U.S. to be a leader in space, in the space realm, and calling on the Pentagon to spur studies and develop plans for setting up such a force, and not to be sort of part and parcel of the Air Force as the military leadership would prefer, but actually to be a separate force. And he made a point of saying as a 6th branch. So not just the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and Coast Guard, but the Space Force as well.
So would the Space Force get its own college?
That's a really good question.
The Air Force, when it came in, it got its own college.
One would expect so, Jim. I think let's see how it gets through the other hurdles it's got to jump through. But as I said, that there's especially Defense Secretary Mattis, but also the Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson, that they are not in favor of this. But we'll have to deal with it.
Why aren't they in favor of it? I mean, what's the
they see among other things a major sort of bureaucratic headache, I guess, in the layering up of Pentagon bureaucracy at a time when they're trying to prune it away, and they're trying to fight a tough battle, because once these things do get created, they are very hard to eliminate. So they see it as sort of a natural outgrowth of what the Air Force has been doing. The Air Force is obviously up in the wild blue yonder, and
so the Air Force is the service that sort of feels most threatened by?
I would say so, yeah. And the Air Force itself grew out of, I think it was the Army Air Corps,
because it began as the Army Air Corps.
Army Air Corps, right.
And then it was spun out. And at the time, there was a lot of arguments that was unnecessary. And, of course, it's one of the great stories of organizational competition, because when they created the Air Force and moved it out of the Army, there was a policy written that the Army was not allowed to maintain fixed-wing aircraft over a certain size, because you didn't want to have multiple air forces. And that spurred the Army to really look at helicopters, because helicopters would provide them with mobility that they couldn't get through fixed-wing aircraft, because they weren't allowed to have fixed-wing aircraft of the size needed to move troops in great numbers. And, of course, people would argue today the United States actually has not 1, not 2, but 3 air forces. You have the U.S. Air Force, you have Navy aviation, and you have Marine aviation. And, again, one of the ironies is that while they all fly planes, they like different kinds of planes because they have different missions, and that can be very hard to build, because everybody wants to build a multi-mission plane, because that would save you money. And you end up spending a lot of money trying to build a multi-mission plane that can work across services. And it's been, I think, one of the things that's bedeviled the U.S. military for quite a while.
So to the extent any of them have roles or ambitions in outer space, we can see why this is creating a great deal of consternation, I guess, Jim. But let's see it. The formal request has gone out, and they are duly charged with following up on it. So watch this space, and we'll see where this goes. How about you, Jim? What's your figure of the week?
Bob, my figure of the week is a person. I'm going with Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She announced this week that the United States is pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council, calling it, and let me quote her here, a cesspool of political bias. The argument for leaving is that the UN Human Rights Council has been repeatedly stocked with countries like China, Venezuela, Russia, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Egypt that do not have good human rights records. And I should mention, as I understand it, Ambassador Haley named all of those countries in her announcement. And she blamed the fact that the UN Human Rights Council has had a chronic anti-Israel bias that was not worthy of the organization's name. Not a surprise. The Trump administration has been threatening this for a while. General hostility in the administration to multilateral organizations. And the UN Human Rights Council is at best a glass half full. I know some people, former colleague Mark Lagon has done some work saying that, yeah, there's a lot wrong with the UN Human Rights Council, but actually the United States being a member of it actually curbed a lot of those tendencies. And I think there are people who would argue, invoking the old phrase that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, that by pulling the United States out, that it'll make it easier for these countries who are clearly hostile to democratic values, aren't promoting democratic rule or rule of law, to get their way, and it will actually lead to more criticism of Israel. So So we'll see how it will play out. But this is, in fact, one instance in which this administration has actually spoken about protecting human rights and the rule of law, which has not been known for. It's not clear, of course, that this will have any useful effect.
This debate has happened repeatedly. It happened with the predecessor to the Rights Council, which is the UN Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, the Human Rights Council was to replace the flawed commission.
Because the flaws were so widely known, and I think the NGO community referred to it as a coalition of the abusers, basically, where these countries got on the commission and were able to block any action involving their own records. The Human Rights Council was set up by basically saying everybody is going to come under scrutiny no matter what. There's going to be no sort of special teeing up of naming and shaming of a smaller group of countries. However, there is this ongoing, this problem, this focus on Israel's record to the exclusion of other issues that should come up more frequently. The problem is also, as you indicated, Jim, the U.S. was in a position, though, to mitigate some investigations that were quashed sort of at the outset, and instead being on the outside, it can raise alarm, but it doesn't have a place at the table anymore to block them. And we heard an announcement that Russia is now interested in applying to join the council. And so, do you then just yield the council over to more misuse, or do you work on the sidelines to try to make it better and then rejoin it?
Right. I would imagine that it's going to end up being misused even more. But I should also note that the Trump decision to pull out of the UN Human Rights Council is not unprecedented. The Bush administration boycotted after it was formed in 2006. It was Barack Obama who had the United States rejoin, because his calculation was it is better to be inside the tent, inside the room, sort of arguing and blunting these initiatives, and to pull out and to let this organization operate under the imprimatur of the United Nations as if it really is doing its mission, as opposed to being an organization that's stocked with countries who are there to prevent their own behavior and the behavior of their like-minded colleagues from being criticized.
I would just add one other thing. In addition to the Israel issue, the Human Rights Council suffered from, as you mentioned, the problem of membership. This is something that's a problem throughout the UN system, frankly, and it's what you're going to get with a universal organization. There are any number of commissions that have states serving on them that are either under sanction or under some sort of censure that in most estimations should never be in that position, but they are, because of the way the UN is set up. There's an issue there's a membership problem, especially concerning special agencies at the UN, that they still need to sort out.
I mean, again, go back to the list of countries that Ambassador Haley listed. Is China a bastion of human rights? Venezuela, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt? And the answer, I think, to that is no. And that's a problem with these kind of organizations. And that's why, there have been calls occasionally over time that the United States should look to found, let's call it a D40 or a D60. That is an organization of democratic states that are like-minded and believe in universal values and believe in human rights, and that they should band together to form a counterweight, much in the way that Brazil and South Africa and China and India have created the BRICS to try to create a counterweight. But that's often been opposed by people who share an interest in promoting democracy, rule of law, and human rights on the grounds that you don't want to undercut this universal organization, and that democracies don't always agree on things, which is true, they don't, but they tend to agree on some very important things. And I would say that if the BRICS countries can come together having, as best I can tell, no sort of organizing theme or binding principle other than they're not the G7, then I don't know why the democratic countries can't come together to do something. There have been some efforts on that front, but they never really sort of taken off. But this is a real problem and a real tension about, should you embrace a universal organization that's going to have exactly the kind of pathologies you alluded to, where the bad apples try to join the powerful committees, or do you leave out and sort of give up on the dream of universality and try to, form a coalition of the willing and the like-minded? So, big issues.
And that's our look at the world and perhaps solar system next week. Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. The UN Independent Panel on Syria presents its latest report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And African leaders meet for an anti-corruption summit.
Let us know how you feel about the world next week, or tweet us your figure of the week at CFR_org using hashtag TWNW. Also, be sure to subscribe to The World Next Week on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find our show. Please note that opinions expressed in The World Next Week are solely those of the host or our guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions. Today's program was produced by Audrey Bowler with senior producer Jeremy Sherlock. Our recording engineer was John Perry. Corey Cooper, Chad Borgman, and Angela Peterson provided research assistance. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons. This is Jim Lindsay saying goodbye.
And this is Bob McMahon saying so long.